So I decided to take a little hiatus on Radio Radix. I keep saying Radio Radix. On Radix Reflects, since I was getting everything ready for the update video that came out a while ago. I guess it would be a while ago at this point. But I decided I'd try a new thing where whenever a topic idea popped up in my head for Radix Reflects, I wrote it down on a notepad file on my phone. So now that I've had some time to assemble some topics, I'm gonna be, wiping them all out, trying to talk about all the topics idea I have. So I definitely was more passionate about these topics when I wrote them down, and now I don't really know exactly what I wanted to talk about. I don't even know the context as to why I thought of this topic idea, or the upcoming topic idea. So let's see what we got. The Spider-Man trilogy. 2 isn't that good, 3 isn't that bad. I can't remember why all of a sudden in my head the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy and how I disagree with the common consensus over the trilogy came into my head. But here we are, so let's talk about the Spider-Man trilogy from Sam Raimi. I was thinking about this earlier, and I don't exactly remember when I watched the first Spider-Man movie. I know I definitely knew about Spider-Man in kindergarten at least, but I remember being older than most people should be when they're introduced to Spider-Man. So those two kind of contradict each other, so I'm not sure about the timeline here. It's like a writer wrote my backstory, but then it was multiple writers and one writer didn't hear the obscure story where I learned about Spider-Man in this story. So here's a new story where he writes the origin of how I discovered Spider-Man. But whatever. I don't know my age. I don't know the year. Had to be before kindergarten, probably. But I did not know what Spider-Man was. My first superhero I knew was Batman from the Tim Burton Batman. We watched it on tape. We went to at some point, which is like a thrift store. I don't know if that's like a South exclusive thing or North Carolina exclusive thing. Let me Google real quick, just in case there are across the world and I just sound like an idiot. Okay, not only does that thrift store isn't a worldwide chain, that thrift store is like isolated to only my location. It's like there's like 6 of them, so I thought it was a franchise, but the 6 of them are in like my town and the surrounding towns that, are just as far away from me, just my region. It's like a whole franchise located just where I am, so I'm gonna have to bleep myself out to not give away my location. But whatever. Went to the thrift store. I saw the Batman symbol. I had known Batman. Well, I guess the Batman movie wasn't my introduction to Batman then. I think my introduction to Batman was an animated series. I'm not sure which animated series, though. Maybe the DC Animated Universe Batman animated series. But, so why did I start talking about because Tim Burton's Batman was the first superhero movie I ever watched on tape. This was before DVDs were a thing. And then I figured out about Superman at some point, but I did not know who Spider-Man was. I did not know what Marvel was for a long time. I only thought that the only superheroes out there were DC, Batman, and Superman, and that's it. So at some point, my family rents the first Spider-Man movie from Blockbuster, so that on tape. So that I'm really dating myself here. We rented the tape from Blockbuster. But there was a time in my life where I spent a lot of time at my dad's office, just because my family couldn't, have me be with anyone else. They didn't want me to be with a babysitter for various reasons. And I wouldn't want to be with a babysitter. They took me to the office, and I would be sitting in their office for, freaking 9 a.m. to about 2 a.m. I was there forever. They work hours that look like your average Japanese person hours, and not your average American person's hours. But, so yeah, freaking 9 to 2 a.m. or whatever. But I would be staying in a room and I'd be bored. So at some point they rented Spider-Man on VHS, and they told me to watch it. And I think my dad rented it and let me watch it, which most of the movies he watches are or at least at that point, were like martial arts movies or Western movies, and I didn't care for either of them, which is ironic considering that I'm a black belt and a person studying history. You would think I would be into martial arts movies and Westerns. I'm really not. But, so I was expecting this Spider-Man movie to be boring. So I, put in Spider-Man, I sit down, put into the VCR, sit down, and it comes up, and there's the Spider-Man movie. And the beginning was boring, because I was a kid with a low attention span, but once the dude was in the red and blue uniform, I'm like, oh hey, this is like one of those Supermans. And that's how I was introduced to Spider-Man. And eventually I watched Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3. By the time I was watching Spider-Man 2 and 3, DVDs had come along. So, and eventually I got the Spider-Man 1 DVD too. I think I got 1 and 2 in like a 2-set pack thing. But yeah, I like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. When I think Spider-Man, I think that trilogy. When I think Peter Parker in my head, I'm thinking of Tobey Maguire. I went for a long time never reading a Spider-Man comic. In fact, I think I've only read a few Spider-Man comics from the 60s, and then Spider-Man appears in some Marvel books I own and have read, like Civil War, and he shows up in a lot of the early Moon Knight stuff. But I never watched the Amazing Spider-Man 2 films. I never watched them. I have watched Spider-Man Homecoming and Civil War and Infinity War that has the MCU Spider-Man in it. And I like the MCU Spider-Man, but I really like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, Peter Parker Spider-Man, just because that's what I grew up with. That's what solidified in my head as what Spider-Man should be, just like Kevin Conroy's voice solidified in my head as to how Batman's voice should be. Now there seems to be this consensus that Spider-Man 1 is good, Spider-Man 2 is great, like the second coming of Jesus Christ, and then Spider-Man 3 is the worst thing to ever be made on film. Now, I'm going to go against the grain by making an unpopular opinion, that I think all 3 Spider-Man movies are about the same. I think they're pretty good. I think 1 is pretty good, 2 is pretty good, 3 is pretty good. I don't hold 2 up to this like ridiculous standard where people are like, I heard people, when it came to like Spider-Man Homecoming, they said if Spider-Man Homecoming isn't as good or better than Spider-Man 2, then it wasn't even worth it. And like, why? To me, who never really gauged the quality of this trilogy, I was like, why Spider-Man 2? That's kind of specific, because I always thought the 3 are sort of the same quality. But like eventually, as I've traversed the internet like the great traveler, I found that Spider-Man 2 is treated like the second coming of Jesus Christ. I think Spider-Man 2 is fine. I don't think it's like the Dark Souls of superhero movies or whatever. I don't think it's the greatest thing to grace the planet's surface, like some people seem to talk about Spider-Man 2. I think it was a solid movie, just like Spider-Man 1 before it. Now, Spider-Man 3, I can see more of the criticism of Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 sometimes is on the level of like a prequel Star Wars movie. Kind of memey, that we sort of make fun of it. I think the plot was sort of all over the place, but overall, I think the themes in Spider-Man 3 was consistent with the rest of the Spider-Man trilogy. I think some of the acting, especially with Harry Osborn, sort of took a bad turn in Spider-Man 3. But, I really liked Venom. I liked this interpretation of Eddie Brock better than I liked the comic Eddie Brock. Just because this Eddie Brock sort of was more like an evil Peter Parker. Not an evil Peter Parker, but a Peter Parker who let his flaws overcome him. And that's what makes Venom interesting in that movie. Now, I don't like how he spends a lot of the movie without the Venom mask. I know a lot of people don't like the contrivance of having Sandman be Uncle Ben's killer, but I was okay with that. But again, keep in mind that I'm not exactly the most solid Spider-Man fan. All I've seen are the movies. Plus a few single issues here and there about Spider-Man. So maybe that's the problem. Maybe I'm not hardcore Spider-Man fan enough, And there are a lot of hardcore Spider-Man fans out there. Spider-Man is probably... back when I only knew Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man, Spider-Man was probably my second favorite hero. Batman was the first dude I was introduced to, and Batman has been my favorite forever. Just because I guess I relate more to Batman. Although I do... Maybe it's because I relate more to Batman, but also because Superman hasn't been written in a way that I like him often. The Superman stories that I relate the most to, the Superman stories that I really like, are those that sort of focus on the fact that Superman isn't human, and yet he was born and raised human. Where Superman sort of serves as this bridge between the Kryptonian and human worlds, and how he has this attachment to both the humans because they raised him, and this attachment to Krypton and Kryptonian culture because, those were his ancestors. And he sort of wants to keep his own culture alive, seeing as he's the last Kryptonian. If you know me, you probably don't need an explanation as to why that side of the Superman mythos is the one that really attracts me the most, because it's the one I can relate to the most, being mixed race from two very different cultures. So I really like that whole bridge between two worlds type thing that you get with Superman. But besides that, whenever his human side isn't elaborated on more, Superman, I think, works almost better as a Justice League or Batman supporting character rather than his own character. But I think Spider-Man can stand on his own. But Batman's always been my favorite in my book. So Spider-Man, yeah, I think the three movies are about equal in quality. You can say there's a dip with Spider-Man 3, but I don't see how Spider-Man 2 is any better than Spider-Man 1. I think they're both pretty close-knit as far as how equal in quality they are, in my opinion, at least. I'm sure Spider-Man fans are going to kill me. Also, I want you to count how many times my voice cracked this episode. Jesus Christ.